that the main method is done by the operating system itself. What the OS does is it looks at the manifest file that we've actually created. And so this is a full-fledged Android manifest file that has been not redacted for simplicity, so that we can actually see how some of these things work. Again, notice that this is the manifest XML element. Uses a minimum SDK version of 3, which is now ancient. There's no need for you to use version 3. That's like Android 1.5 or something. So only if you want maximum compatibility do you really need to do that. But even then, there's problems using minimum SDK version of 3. It implies certain permissions that are not necessarily what you would want. I think it wants full access to contacts and some other stuff that if you just upgrade the minimum SDK version to 4 or 5, then you lose a lot of these problems that actually existed. But this is meant for maximum compatibility here. Now the application, within it we actually define where the icon is for that app on the home screen of the device. It's within, you'll notice, @drawable. Remember I mentioned that drawable directory within our resources. We can have various resolutions of our icons to support the different density and different sized screens that might exist. Similarly, can we actually apply a label to the name of that application within the string resource? And provide, you'll notice that here we're looking for a specific resource within the string directory called an app name, which you'll just have to trust me for now that it says something in English. Now, if we skip this and go down to activity, notice that we have defined one activity here. And within it, we have this idea of an intent filter. And what this intent filter actually does is it notifies the OS what this activity should actually do. And there's a variety of filters that we can apply to it. Perhaps we want to restrict this activity from being open in other applications. Remember that I mentioned that within task, we can have other applications request an activity. We can explicitly disallow or allow that with these intent filters. But also, we apply these two elements to this intent filter, telling the OS that this is the main activity, and this is the one that I want launched on boot. Or on boot is opening the application itself. And so really, there's no main method, but that's because we've told the Android OS that we have this activity, and this is the one that we want to run. Now, the activity itself, excuse me, the activity itself goes through a life cycle of sorts. There's a variety of methods that allow you to run some code when the activity has first been called upon to actually open, and then things have been rendered on the screen, and then it's finally ready for use by the user. We're going to ignore a lot of those for now, and I'll defer to the Android documentation for you to get more information on that. But now we can take a look again at our Hello World code and realize how this is actually working. We have a public class, code1. This is just the class for this one activity. Extends activity, because this is, in fact, an object of type activity. I actually want to create some code that launches an activity and displays something to the user. And within that, we have this one method, onCreate. This method is invoked by the OS within this activity object whenever this activity is about to be started. It's saying, OK, I am about to display this activity, so I'm going to create it and display it on the screen. What do you want me to do? It's asking this code, and by asking, I mean it's invoking this method, which allows our code to actually create the layout and apply a layout onto this activity and then display it to the user. So the next few lines, this super.onCreate, we just have to make sure that we actually invoke the main activity class's onCreate method just to do any house cleaning. Otherwise, you will get a very nasty error from the Android plugin or from the SDK when you do this. And then programmatically, are we actually going to create a text view that says some text? We're going to create a text view object, just basically instantiate it in this first highlighted line. Next, we're going to set the text to be displayed by this text view. And then we are going to set the content view, which is the content displayed within this activity. So this is not necessarily a mysterious function call. This is actually a function call that's implemented by the Android activity class that allows us to set the layout for this activity. So basically, the layout for this activity will be what? Any guesses based on this code? Yeah. That's right. So the only thing that will be on the screen when we actually run this activity will just be a text view. But that text view itself is invisible. We don't actually see its bounds. We just see the text that's contained within it. So we should expect to see the text, oh, hi. Now, there's some logging capability stuff down here, which if we had a little bit more time, I would explain is very useful for us to actually get messages from our code back into this really cool little section down here, logcats, which allows you to actually run. It's sort of a console-like way of actually being able to look at errors from your activity. In fact, you can see it says this is an error which masks or which replicates what we see here. This is very good for debugging in the Android world. But if I actually run this code, this is what we would see. So very much like in Xcode, how you have an emulator for iOS, do you have an emulator for Android devices as well? So what's cool about this is that this is actually an emulated Android device, and so I can go to the, oh, I can't see the, we've been bitten by the resolution bug. There's some buttons down here that allow me to go to the home screen, and we can sort of play around with this version of the Android device. Unfortunately, it's cut off. So rest assured, it's there. You can click on it, but not right now. But what this allows us to see is our Hello World application. We have here our activity, which takes up the entirety of the screen. By default, the theme was black. We didn't get to see that, but it's elsewhere actually within the package itself. We have our one text view. It says our text, and that's about it. Up here, this is just the title bar for the application itself. It's a little confusing at first when you expect to only see this, and you also see the title of the application, but realize that that is actually just the Android OS displaying a little title above the application itself. We could give a flag in the manifest that would request that this activity become full screen and hide everything, but we haven't set that flag. We've just done a very simple manifest file here. And of course, we have our system-wide status bar at the very top here. Now, there's a few other things that I want to show you about this. I'm going to make a few of these activities available in the source code for you to download and actually play around with. We don't really have a lot of time to go through them, but hopefully if you just go through them one at a time, they will progress in such a way that you will be able to hopefully start following along as we make slightly more complicated layouts, start adding second activities, and start doing other things with the Android OS. But there's a couple of things that I want to point out about the SDK itself. One of them is that this IDE, again, is Eclipse. This is not written by Google, but in fact is a larger open source project. If you already have Eclipse, download it because you do development in other languages, or even in Java. You can actually download the SDK without including the IDE itself. You can just download the SDK, the plugin, and follow some steps on the developer website to get all of that working in your own version of Eclipse that you might have already installed. But if you don't have it installed already, don't worry about it. You can just download everything and have it work out of the box. Once you have everything set up, though, if you go to this menu, the window menu, you'll notice that you have a couple of new Android options. And I'll zoom in here so that you can see them. You have Android SDK Manager, Android Virtual Device Manager, and Android Lint, which is a checker. But it's these two that we are worried about now, the SDK Manager and the Virtual Device Manager. The SDK Manager allows you to download different versions of the SDK. So if you want to build an application against a specific API number, you have to make sure that you have downloaded that SDK. So if you download all of this, this is going to take up a lot of space. It's several gigabytes worth of information that has to be downloaded onto your computer. But then you could compile your application against any one of these API targets, and it will work just fine. In this case, because I had set in the manifest file the minimum SDK version of 3, so we can see here, I have to make sure that I, in fact, have that version installed. And as you can see, Android 1.5, which is an API level of 3, so realize that there's two different versions The public-facing version is the string Android 1.5, but the API level is an always incrementing integer, which started at 1. Basically, the earliest version that was released to consumers was API level 3, and it just has been going up ever since then. So here we can see that I, in fact, have the SDK platform and the APIs installed. You can do that on your own for whatever version you want to run. But the more fun one, I would say, is the virtual device management.